Welcome to Future², the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future² brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick, digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future² is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future². Before I begin introducing today's guest, I just wanted to let you know that we're running a very, very special Future² live event on August the 31st in Melbourne here at Collective Campus, where I'll be speaking to Ash Moira of Running Lean and Lean Canvas fame. So if you want to pick up a ticket to that, just head to collectivecamp.us/events. It promises to be a huge night with drinks, nibbles, networking opportunities, and an opportunity to hear and ask questions of Ash Moira in the flesh. So that's collectivecamp.us/events. Today I'll be speaking with Max Kelly, who's the current Managing Director of Techstars in London, the world's leading accelerator program for early stage startups. Prior to Techstars, Max spent 12 years at Virgin, where he was responsible for the strategy of the group and for starting new companies, including Virgin Insight, Virgin Mobile USA, Virgin Mobile Canada, and Virgin Healthbank. Virgin Healthbank in particular was focused on freezing stem cells cryogenically. These companies exited for more than $500 million. Alongside his Virgin commitments, Max also co-founded LastSecondTickets.com, which was successfully sold in 2014. So this is an exciting chat with Max from Techstars. We cover all manner of topics, including Brexit, corporate startup partnerships, what corporates need to think about when connecting or going into a partnership with startups, what they need to think about when setting up an accelerator, what they should look for in entrepreneurs, in ideas, in business models, what some of the challenges are behind corporate startup partnerships and how to successfully navigate those challenges, and a ton of other things that I won't even begin to mention now. So without further ado, I bring you Max Kelly. Welcome to the show, Max.
Thanks very much, Steve, for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. And, incidentally enough, when I was researching you, one of the first things that popped up was a YouTube clip of yourself in a Tesla virtual reality suit. Have you been dabbling with many VR applications as of late?
So one of the companies that's in Techstars London at the moment is creating 3D avatars from a single photo. And so we actually have they're at SIGGRAPH at the moment over in LA, and they're really great companies. So some, but not I have to say, not a massive amount. But I think it's going to be interesting how it unfolds. Oh yeah, it's so many applications. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking all about NextVR in the States and how they're essentially streaming live sports, and you can sit courtside at a LA Lakers game, and that's what gets me excited. Sitting over here on the other side of the world in Melbourne, being able to beam myself to, London, the Emirates, or Old Trafford, and just watch a game as if I was there in the flesh is just super exciting. Yeah, I think it's such an immersive experience that it does make a big difference, I think. But yes, it'll be interesting. It's the challenge is, are people going to create enough content that's compelling? And then when that does happen, which eventually it obviously will, then are people going to be disappointed by the real world that they have to live in when they take a step out of virtual reality? That's a much bigger philosophical, ethical, human question, I guess, which is quite interesting. But
So, Max, you're currently the managing director of Techstars in London. For the sake of our audience who might be unfamiliar with Techstars, and I hope there's not many of them in our audience, but can you just give them a quick sort of 20-second rundown on what Techstars is?
Sure. So we take companies, and normally about 1,000 apply, and we take 10 companies through a 3-month acceleration program focused on mentorship, and then understanding how to build a business, and then through to a demo day where about 600 people attend, half of whom are potential investors, and the companies present. And we really help them build their companies, build their product, or certainly think about how to do that in the most effective way, and also how they're going to build that through into the future and build large and sustainable companies. Fantastic.
And does Techstars look for any particular type of companies, or is it industry-centric at all? Or?
So the background of Techstars, so it started in 2007 with some guys who had exited successfully and over in the US in Boulder in Colorado, and they said being an entrepreneur is a pain in the ass, why don't we help some other entrepreneurs do this well? And so they put together a program, wrote a playbook, published that playbook open source, and and built initially one accelerator, and then opened up in Seattle and Boston in 2010, and then London was the 5th location in 2013. Now there are 23 Techstars programs around the world, and some of them are kind of city focused, so very broad focus, and then some are industry specific. So what happened was some large corporates said, look, we think we're being disrupted here. We don't really know what to do about it when it comes to startups. The first one who said that to us was Microsoft, so we ran a program for them. Then Nike with a fuel band, and now there's in retail there's Target in the US and Metro in Europe. In entertainment, there's Virgin Media, and until recently Disney. In health tech, there's Cedars-Sinai and Mayo Clinic. In fintech, there's Barclays. In automotive, there's Ford and Honda. So there's a bunch of large corporates who were supporting, running programs, the same kind of program. But across the world, we've now got 23 accelerators.
That's fantastic. And I guess one of the things that sets Techstars apart is the fact that failure rates are about 10% in terms of the amount of companies who aren't active at the moment. So as far as the Techstars alumni is concerned, 90% of the companies are still active in some way, shape or form. Most startup failure rates in most ecosystems around the world hover between 90 to 95%. So Techstars has essentially turned the tables on that. And I guess this ties back to what you were saying earlier about successful founders having put together this playbook to essentially help select startups stand on the shoulders of giants.
And yeah, I have to say it's amazing. It's been going for it's going from 2007. So to some extent, it's still early days, and that it's likely that more companies that once they've had time to grow won't actually, not all of them will succeed. But yeah, at the moment you're right. It's either 90% have either been are still functioning or have been acquired. So it's a pretty stellar result. On a very big base. I think over 800 companies have gone through. So it's a big total. I think one of the things is that we get a large set of applications, but then we only take 10 companies in. And the people who are running the accelerators are normally seasoned entrepreneurs. So I started up 4 different businesses when I was at Virgin, and one whilst I was at Virgin but outside the group. So I've been through a whole number of startups myself, and that kind of experience is pretty consistent across all of the managing directors of Techstars programs. And with the focus of having that plus a huge and really high-quality mentor pool for each of the programs, means that the companies are then massively supported, and that kind of support that we can help them in many different ways.
Yeah, and I read that Techstars Boston MD Katie Ray says that one of the other things that sets Techstars startups apart is that they have an incredibly tight-knit bond.
Yeah, so the cohorts here, when they go through, one of the things we do encourage the companies is to make sure that they build kind of cross-company strength. So every week I get all of the CEOs of the companies together who are in cohort and have a conversation. And really it's about building ties between the companies there. We also have social activity every week. I've got an all-hands later today where everyone is sitting down saying their highs and lows for the week. So it's all about kind of building a network so that people can have something to lean back on when Techstars program is no longer running. They've still got 50 people in the cohort who they can reach out to at any stage, who they know really, really well, who they know are going to support them. And then obviously for each program, there's about 100 mentors, plus then beyond that, all of the partner organizations who are part of sponsorship or supporting the program. So we one of our brand values is network over hierarchy. Yeah. And we think that the network is really important for, and to be honest, whether it's this particular company that people are doing or whether it's the next company they do, actually having amazing people supporting other amazing people, that's what it's really all about.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a few things there that I wanted to explore a bit further. I mean, you did touch there on not necessarily being this company, maybe the next one or maybe the one after that, and that's quite synonymous with the way that many investors view their investment decisions. It's not necessarily that they invest in a startup or an idea per se, it's about the team behind the idea, and oftentimes startup founders need to fail once or twice before they really manage to crack that code.
So yeah, we say there are 6 criteria that we use to select the companies. And the first 3 are people, and then it's market traction idea. So we're so early. So normally the companies are, 3 to 5 people. About half of them have revenue, half don't. We do range from 2 people up to 20 people. So it depends, and we do go from kind of no funding all the way through to late Series A, but. Generally speaking, it's, as I say, it's about 3 to 5 people. It's a very international crew that we've got here this year in London. So we counted up of the 45 or so people that we had 19 separate nationalities. So it's a hugely international, very diverse group, and fascinating, but all focused on the people, how they interact with others, what their backgrounds are, how they execute, all kind of working towards having just astonishingly great people.
And how important do you think it is, Max, to have so many people coming together from disparate sort of backgrounds, different parts of the world?
I don't necessarily think it's really important. I mean, a lot of programs over in the US will just have primarily US companies come in. The nature of London, and I know what the next question is going to be, but the nature of London is that it's incredibly international. I think 40% of people who live in London are non-UK born. So it's just it's a kind of a very strong magnet for entrepreneurship. About a third of all VC cash in Europe goes through London. So it's an amazingly vibrant entrepreneurial environment, and so it attracts some amazing talent. So it doesn't surprise me that we have such an international group of people as part of the cohort. Yeah.
Well, you did kind of allude to it there in that little spiel. So, I mean, London being an epicenter of startup activity, I believe it's the 6th strongest startup ecosystem in the world, and you mentioned that there are a high proportion of non-UK born citizens, and I have to ask, what's the general sort of consensus or vibe like post the Brexit decision?
So I think it's a bit of a surprise for a lot of people. So in London, I think the vote was 60-40 to remain, and that was the little bubble I was living in, and then I saw a figure only today saying 90% of founders, of startup founders, wanted to remain. So my little universe, I was very convinced that this was just all a bit of a sideshow and it wasn't going to turn into anything. So when it actually happened, I was kind of just shocked, and I'm still slightly in denial now. I don't know how it's all going to unfold. Certainly the startup community is a bit taken aback, and uncertainty is not good for any market. But there are lots of micro VCs here. There's lots of angels. We have some amazing tax structure for early stage investing for angels. So it's been very vibrant over the last few years. Whether this takes the edge off, I think it probably will take a bit of an edge off in terms of the fundraising environment, which means that there'll be kind of slightly fewer companies funded. That may or may not affect the Techstars companies. So I guess from my perspective, it's a bit of a disappointment. What actually unfolds, obviously, as I say, I'm slightly in denial, so I'm hoping perhaps it won't fully unfold. But assuming it does, then we're going to have, we've got an infrastructure in place now that supports the startup community. Startup community is very vibrant. I think it'll slow that pace, and for that I'm very disappointed. I think that London had created, somewhat inadvertently, but created itself as a massive hub for innovation around this area, and it's a very important area as we go into the future. So I was very pleased about that, and so I guess for me it's a certain level of disappointment, but with a pragmatism to say that we've actually got a lot in place that means we can drive this forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned the area there, and I was fortunate enough to be over in London a few weeks ago and spent a bit of time down at the Silicon Roundabout and, checked out Google Campus and the like, and there was just so much buzz about the place, even at, what's it called, Magic Roundabout on top of Old Street Station, the burger place there, it's just full of startups, full of hipsters as well, lots of beers, but that usually means good coffee is in reach, which is a good thing.
It does, yes. For people of your part of the world, actually, coffee is not always great here. But yeah, over in that, where there's a beer or two, there's fantastic coffee.
Exactly, that's why I was spending so much time there. But it is an interesting thing, and I think one of the lessons that came out of that, even for me, having spent some time up there, it just seems as if, and I think you touched on it there, we're all kind of living in our own little bubbles. And, everyone thought, oh, no, it's just a formality, of course we'll remain. But we kind of didn't see the world from the viewpoint of everybody else who perhaps doesn't share our values and whatnot.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You look at Oxford, Cambridge, London, Brighton, Bristol. Those are the areas in England that voted to remain. And those, I studied in Oxford, I live in London. I have an affinity to those kind of places. I guess from my perspective, and actually probably a lot of people in London, the kind of not really understanding the level of disengagement and resentment that was across the country, and I think there's a lot of surprise about the result.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in those other parts of the country just felt as if they perhaps weren't being represented. And I think there was a great TED talk on this. The name of it escapes me, but I'll look it up and include it in the show notes, where the speaker spoke about inclusive globalization, which was an interesting talk.
Yeah, and let's not even start on what's going on in the US. That's a whole different.
Yeah, well, so let's not digress too much from the topic of conversation. So let's get back on track. So we won't spend too much time on Brexit. I'm sure we could talk about that all day, but we have touched on a few of the different corporates that are engaging Techstars to help them better innovate and engage the startup ecosystem. And Barclays is one company which has accelerators, or has Techstars accelerators based in New York, London, Tel Aviv, and Cape Town, and is essentially on the lookout for startups who are pushing innovation across the financial services industry. So everything from cybersecurity, AI, wealth management, big data, cryptocurrency, and blockchain. How important is it that large companies like Barclays engage in partnerships with startups?
I think it's incredibly important. Barclays is a really interesting one. So Barclays, if you think about financial services in maybe 5 to 10 years' time, you can see that it's just going to be incredibly different how people interact with their money. And a lot of financial organisations are kind of paralysed into not changing for a number of reasons. One of the primary reasons is the legacy of both their infrastructure and also their customer base, which means that they find it incredibly difficult to innovate. So one of the reasons why running an accelerator program is attractive and often getting Techstars to do that for them is because it means that the antibodies that normally kill innovation in an organization find it difficult to kill the vibrant startups that are coming through. Now, Barclays have been very bold about this and have created not just one, like most of the corporates who work with us, but actually 4 different locations, as you said. So they're taking it extremely seriously. And I think in the most recent Barclays London Accelerator, I think all of the companies who went through the program had a proof of concept in conjunction with Barclays. So they are aiming to change and understand the need for change, but it's really, really hard. I mean, God, I was at Virgin for 12 years. My job was starting up new companies for the Virgin Group. I started up 4 different companies there, and I was responsible for the strategy for a period of time. And I remember one of the questions I had was that we were addressing was, is Virgin innovative enough? And my view was it wasn't. And that was a company that's obviously thought quite synonymously with innovation. So if that's the case for a company that is perceived as being very innovative, then for a lot of other companies, it's a real challenge.
Yeah. I mean, there's all types of challenges, whether it's the legacy infrastructure you alluded to, the values that can oftentimes be the antithesis of innovation, avoiding failure, avoiding risk at all costs, and processes and policies which reward or measure success based on ROI or internal rate of return, just to name a few. I mean, what are some of the other big-ticket antibodies to corporate innovation that you've come across?
God.
Where do you begin?
Yeah, where do we begin? I think one of the observations I have, which is not quite answering the question, but one of the observations is looking at companies and how long they stay in the S&P 500. So in 1960, the average length that a company would stay in the S&P 500 would be 60 years, and now the average has dropped down to 11 years. Yeah, and that's been a fairly consistent drop over time. There's some very nice graphs on this. But what that means is, in a decade, half the companies that we recognise in the S&P 500 won't be there. Yep. And that'll either be because they failed, or they've merged, or they've shrunk and been purchased, like Yahoo. I mean, it just the interesting thing for me is just these companies will simply no longer exist in their current form. So there'll be literally 250 of the 500 will be sitting there complacently thinking, we're all good, everything's fine, and then they suddenly find that they are Blockbuster or Kodak, and everything wasn't quite as rosy as they thought. And that's going to happen. And so it's not quite the answer to your question is what drives it. I mean, it's more what's the outcome, which is they won't exist.
Yeah, and I've seen that research. I believe it was Insight who put that together, about half of the S&P being replaced in 10 years' time. And, the time between disruptions just getting shorter and shorter. I mean, you look at, music devices over the last century, and it went from something like 30 to 40 years between different sort of disruptive devices. And more recently, we went from the iPod, which feels like just yesterday we were all listening to music on iPods via iTunes, and now it's more likely to be smartphones via, say, Spotify. And Apple Music is now trying to play catch-up to Spotify. So that's how quickly we're moving these days. So, I mean, how aware do you think corporate executives are? Because to me it seems as if it's maybe there's a percentage of corporate executives out there who acknowledge it's a problem and are trying to do something about it, a percentage who acknowledge it's a problem and are perhaps not doing anything about it or just engaging in innovation theatre, and a vast amount who perhaps aren't responding. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I love the concept of innovation theatre. I've not heard that phrase before, so that's brilliant. I agree with you completely. I think a lot of organisations. So I did about a year or so ago. I was like, just the idea that chief marketing officers, I was doing it to a marketing conference, and they were talking about the impact of digital and data on the role of marketing, and I was kind of talking about the impact of technology. And I think for some people in organisations, they're not born digital native. They don't really get the whole data side of stuff, so they're basically just clinging on for one of two outcomes. One is to get promoted far enough that they don't have to worry about that anymore, or the other one is that they can retire before it really impacts their role. And I think there's a lot of people who are just kind of either in denial or just plain scared. But I think one of the things that's going to be the nature of the workplace going forward is it's going to be continual learning and continual change. As new skills are required to do new things. And for me, that's very exciting. But I do know that for some organisations, some people, it's not.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be absolutely critical, that adaptability, that traditional approach that companies have taken where you plan comprehensively. Here's your 3 to 5 year strategy. I mean, how can you even have a 5-year strategy when the rate between disruptions, or the rate at which companies are being disrupted, and the exponential growth that Moore's Law brings is just at a point now that we've never seen before.
I agree with that. When I was at Virgin, we were building Virgin Mobile in the US. We would have, it went from 0 to $1 billion turnover in about 18 months, and it was massive growth. But we would have a 5-year business plan that we built, and we would do funding on the back of that. It's just a completely different world, and that's only 15 years now. That it's complete anathema for an organisation, particularly the kind of companies that are coming to Techstars, that they would have any real visibility beyond 18 months, and really it's understanding their cash burn for the next year and where they're going to get to for their next milestone. So the world has just fundamentally changed with respect to innovation, and I think it's very tough for large organisations to be able to compete in that environment.
Yeah, and I guess that's why partnering with startups who are able to move quickly, rapidly experiment, and just focus on solving multiple customer problems. And if they have to fail 20 times and fail smart and fail small to find what works, they can do that. Whereas the whole concept of rapid experimentation and failure and putting your brand on the line in a large organization is just quite foreign.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough, and you also put your career somewhat on the line as well, which is also tough.
Yeah, exactly, and that's another thing. I guess the values of many corporate executive is all about doing the right thing all the time, not falling over, not failing publicly, and that's essentially what's gotten them to where they are today. But now we're suddenly entering a world where we're telling them, well, actually, you need to fail. Being right all the time is not what we're after, and you don't have all the answers. You need to collaborate with people throughout the organization and maybe even go outside the building.
Yeah, and that's a pretty foreign set of things to ask people to do mid-career.
Yeah, exactly. So on getting companies like Barclays to work with startups, Max, I mean, what are some of the challenges, given that they, I suppose, do have these different values?
One of them is, you may have someone who really wants to work with a startup, but then they get put into the procurement process. That can kill a company. Like that. There's a level of expectation of due diligence on the organisation that would be fine for a company, 100 times the size or 1,000 times the size. But actually, if you're going to deal with these kind of companies, they won't have everything in place that you want them to have. But that doesn't mean that they can't deliver. So that's a tough thing. I think there's also a cynicism as to whether a company's going to be around, a startup's going to be around in 12 months' time. So there's also another one, which is kind of going back to your startup theatre, that people want to be seen to be doing stuff that's interesting, but actually are just leading startups on, and actually don't have any real plan to use them, and that can be very destructive for organisations, small companies, because if they're banking on revenue coming in and that, and they haven't got any other kind of sources of revenue, that can be a very significant no-go for their business. Whereas not sure people in large organisations necessarily understand the difficulty that startups can have.
Yeah, and that again comes back to that misalignment of values. I mean, as a startup, you've only got a limited runway. You do everything you can to extend that runway and get as much ROI on every dollar spent that you possibly can, or as many learnings as you possibly can. Whereas, I guess, in a large organization, oftentimes people, you've got that steady paycheck coming in, so you're probably not under as much pressure. And if you take a meeting and entertain a startup and maybe take several meetings with them, you don't feel as if you're actually doing anything to disrupt that startup. But essentially that startup may be investing quite a bit of their own energy into that company, and then ultimately nothing comes of it. So that again comes back to that theater. And that's something that I think many entrepreneurs figure out after a few encounters. But on this topic of theater, I mean, I wrote a blog post on this called the Corporate Innovation Hierarchy of Needs. And at the bottom of the hierarchy, you had being seen to be doing something, like you said a few moments ago. And oftentimes it's things like, well, let's send our most senior executives to Silicon Valley and let them go on a tour, and they'll come back and try and galvanize people at a big meeting, but that's pretty much it. And there's no real strategy or roadmap or funding or anything to take anything beyond that. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it's CB Insights have got a great infographic on corporate, exactly what you just described.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh dear, really?
Yeah. Or running hackathons where there's no focus on problem, solution, customer segment, business model, and no money made available to actually take any prototypes further post the event.
I completely agree.
What are some of the key questions, Max, that large companies should answer if they're looking to set up or leverage a startup accelerator? And I guess it kind of ties into what we've just been talking about.
Well, actually, I mean, from going back to my kind of to strategize at Virgin rather than my Techstars hat, I would say the thing that they need to do is think about what they're, where, not in a business plan kind of way, but where are they going to be in 5 to 10 years' time? Yeah. Are they going to be the 1 in 2 companies aren't going to be in the S&P 500? Is that going to be them or not? If they have some idea of where they want to go to, so. Then what are the means at their disposal in order to be able to get there? And if one of those is engaging with a startup community, then there are a number of different ways of doing that, and that could be, but you have to do it in an authentic and real way rather than some sort of like the startup theatre thing that we've just been referring to, but kind of not in a patronising or pretend kind of way.
Yeah,
it's actually properly engaging with innovation. So, and that's really the big question, I think, is how do they engage with innovation? And it might be that they decide that they're going to, create innovation internally. But if they're going to engage with the startup community, do that in an effective manner. Yeah. One choice is to do an accelerator, and some organisations do that themselves, and some people do it in an excellent fashion, some people do it terribly. Obviously, we get a tremendous amount of companies, corporates approaching us to run accelerators. I think we get probably like the equivalent of 1 qualified lead a day. Wow. So maybe 350 a year, and we'll probably do 10 of those. So. We want to make sure that the alignment of the organisation, that they're true to what they're trying to achieve, and that it's not just some sort of cosmetic example of trying to do something for innovations, do something authentic around innovation. Don't do it in order to be able to say that you are in some sort of PR message. Well, exactly right. And I think, if you were to just take on board any company who in most cases would just be partaking in this theater, then it would ultimately reflect poorly on the brand, and you probably wouldn't have the success that Techstars has had thus far with the success rates. But I think a great thing you mentioned there around what's the 5 to 10 year view, and maybe one of the questions is, what does our industry look like in 10 years, and can we operate, can we compete with our current business model? I mean, you look at banks and
The blockchain is an interesting one where it has the ability potentially to just take all the costs, time, settlement risk, counterparty risk, systemic risk out of the equation. And, Wall Street trades in risk. So what happens when, you take all of this risk out of the equation, apply it to, say, payments, FX, remittances? Many of those current business models will be redundant in 10 years if that's the case. Blockchain's an interesting one. It's basically a distributed ledger. I mean, we've got an organisation here called Aid Tech who are coming through our current program, and they are using blockchain in an interesting way to support the distribution of humanitarian aid. It's an enormous amount of aid. Upwards of 300 billion is distributed every year, and an enormous amount of it goes, let's say politely, goes missing along the distribution route, and also is just getting the wrong stuff to the wrong people at the wrong time. And if you can create transparency and efficiency in the supply chain of aid, then you can make some pretty fundamental differences. So I think the blockchain as a technology has multiple potential benefits for different industries. And you talked about a number in financial services, but actually, it can even go as far as humanitarian aid with these guys, as we've got in the cohort already. Yeah, definitely. And one of my prior guests on the podcast was Alex Tapscott, who wrote the book, The Blockchain Revolution. And he told the story of Haiti and the earthquakes and how foreign aid that was supposed to go to the development of homes for 130,000 people actually resulted in the development of 6 homes. And that's the thing with foreign aid when it's being distributed to, say, countries in the third world who have leaders who, for lack of a better word, perhaps don't behave as they should. Like you said, that money just goes missing.
Yeah, and interestingly, there was a conversation that I was part of for Aid Tech yesterday, where one of the aid organisations was having a conversation with them, and it was bizarre. They almost pitched the solution that Aid Tech has put in place.
Oh wow!
Which was we need transparency at the point of consumption. We need to make sure that the right stuff is getting to the right people at the right time, and to the extent that they're thinking about disaster support and triggering support and aid prior to the event actually occurring. And so if they know that there is going to be a rise in water level in Bangladesh that's going to impact hundreds of thousands of people, rather than waiting for that to occur, if they know that's going to occur 3 or 4 days in advance, then they can actually trigger the aid so that it's in place prior to the impact. This is something that's unheard of if you haven't got the ability to distribute stuff at the touch of a button, which this kind of technology can do.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting.
That's very interesting. And I guess smart contracts is one area where you can have all these, I suppose, variables. And if those variables hold true, then that touch of a button is essentially, that button is essentially pushed and that aid can become available. But we'll move on from blockchain. You mentioned earlier, Max, people, ideas, concepts, and so on. What are some of the key sort of attributes that you look for in a Techstars entrepreneur?
Good question. Kind of resilience is a good one. The ability to execute and having demonstrated that previously. So obviously, if they've had success in previous ventures, that's great. But if not, then that they can demonstrate that they can execute and continue to do that. Having a strength in the team, where the team is not all the same, but they're complementary, so they've got different skills in order to deliver whatever it is, whatever area that they're in. It's useful, but not always vital, that they have some industry expertise. What is vital is that they have some kind of world-leading expertise in some way, and we've got some absolutely astonishing people here. This time in my cohort, actually it's interesting. So last time, about half the entrepreneurs had dropped out of university in order to get on with actually creating their businesses. Mm-hmm. This time, about a third of the cohort has a PhD. So it's an interesting how that happens. It's not particularly planned for at all, but it does mean that this time we've got some pretty high tech or deep tech companies that are in the cohort.
Would you say that the PhDs have a different sort of mindset than the guys that dropped out of uni in terms of, do they tend to plan more vigorously and shy away from risk or not so much?
Yes, there is.
Uh-huh.
So I guess the hustle factor for people who have left university earlier and are trying to get on and get shit done.
Yep.
Those guys are a lot more about the hustle. The guys who are doing the PhDs, they're incredibly cerebral, and they need probably more support on how to build a business.
Yeah, that's what I thought the answer would be. So that's on the people side. And what about the ideas themselves? What are some of the key things you look for when evaluating a business model or an idea?
So, as I said, it's people, market, traction, idea. So the market part of it is an interesting market that's, and how competitive is that market. So that's the next thing. The fifth thing in the list is traction. So, have they got clients in place? Have they got, if they're B2C, have they got a lot of engagement with users? And also traction is a great measure of whether people can get shit done.
Yeah.
And then the final thing is the idea. And we just know that going through the Techstars process will mean that their idea will evolve and change significantly during the process. So we don't heavily rely on looking at what their idea is, because we know it's going to change.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that, and I think that is something that is also quite foreign to many corporates, especially when they're first looking to set up these types of programs. If they're trying to do it on their own, they'll just ask questions like, well, what's the idea? How big's the market? Like your typical questions, whereas, you hit the nail on the head. The idea, if executed properly, will evolve significantly based on feedback from peers, feedback from customers, but just going through that process of rapid experimentation, getting stuff out to market, getting those learnings, and just changing and adapting as you go.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it was a little bit foreign to me when I started, but now I completely buy into it, which is it's all about the people.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on that. Okay, a couple more questions just on Techstars, Max. So, we here at Collective Campus work with a lot of companies, large organizations, and oftentimes they raise the question of IP when working with startups. Now, I have my own views on this, but would love to hear how Techstars approaches this with large organizations. Like when the question of IP comes up and incubating startups, what's the Techstars response like?
Well, the startups are their own entity. Mm-hmm. They're developing IP. That IP is theirs.
Yeah.
Now, if they're co-developing IP, then there is a conversation potentially to be had. But if the organisation is doing it in order to generate IP that they think they own, then they're completely in the wrong, because they do not own those companies. And they may have invested in them and they may have a small ownership, but still there are other owners of that organisation, other funders, including the founders. Mm-hmm. And that's where the accrual of IP sits. There will be specific circumstances where IP accrues to both, and then there has to be a discussion around that. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, there's no reason why a large organisation should feel that it has a right over IP that it hasn't developed. Yeah,
no, that makes perfect sense. And finally, on Techstars and managing big company expectations, I alluded to this earlier around metrics such as return on investment, net present value. How do you go about communicating success metrics back to, say, a Barclays or a Disney or a Nike, when those success metrics would usually, in the early stages of a company, be based on things like learnings, based on things like CPA, LTV, the startup Dave McClure's metrics for pirates model. What's our acquisition rate like, engagement, activation, conversion, and so on. Is that a difficult conversation to have initially? I mean, do you often have a lot of pushback just around what's the ROI? What's the ROI?
Well, the key thing, and we've got a team now when we're spinning up these corporate accelerators that really focus on making sure that the corporate really understands what its objectives are.
Yeah.
Because the ROI is almost certainly not in value created in the individual startups. Mm-hmm. It's about having the DNA of innovation injected into the organization so that, almost like a cultural shift. Mm-hmm. But that may not. I mean, that's something I think is extremely important to organisations, but it may not be the main goal. So depending on the individual organisation, they can decide. I mean, often how many proofs of concepts have been implemented, or how many contracts are in place with the companies that have gone through. Mm-hmm. These things are. It actually becomes a means for which senior management within the corporate can communicate that they are serious about innovation. Mm-hmm. And that message alone is massively important for an organisation that is struggling with finding its own future. So I think ROI has to be very carefully understood right from the beginning, and expectations understood from that point, so that actually the relationship develops to meet the expectations of the corporate, really. Yeah,
I love that. I mean, one of the other byproducts of engaging in these types of programs is that, for example, in Barclays' case, it will position them as being more progressive and will help them to attract and retain Gen Y talent and the emerging Gen Z cohorts, rather than just appear to be a big behemoth of a bank that's stuck in the 20th century.
I'm just going to agree with that because I didn't hear much of it.
Well, I'd rather you agree than disagree, Max, so thanks. But we're down to the tail end of the conversation, Max, and this is where I ask all of my guests 3 questions, 2 hypotheticals, and 1 on lifestyle design. So basically, consider this the lightning round. Are you ready?
Provided I can hear, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so if you could work for any company at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be and why?
I would work at the early stage because I love structuring stuff. It's a good question as to who. It might be a large organisation where it's the creation of new businesses, or it might be a new business in its own right. Mm-hmm. Where I think that's probably most interesting is in Google X, where they're doing stuff that is fundamentally groundbreaking. Yeah. That's the stuff I really love. Yeah,
and that's the super exciting stuff now, where companies like Google X, like your SpaceXs of the world, Teslas, are just taking these moonshots to just do what no other company is, essentially has the balls to do. So the next question is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I'd probably sit down with... The thing that I'm most interested in at the moment is the move towards the electrification of everything, and the change in the economics of the production of electricity. I know, slightly bizarre that I'm interested in that, but I think that's pretty fundamental for society. And so I'd probably sit down with either Amory Lovins and talk, who runs the Rocky Mountain Institute, and talk to him about it, or Al Gore.
Fantastic. No, great answer, and not one we've had in the past, so you're in a league of your own there. And the final question, Max, is do you have any rituals or routines that help you stay on top of your game?
That's a good one. So I do an exercise and nutrition plan called Kenzai, Kenzai, which is an awesome plan online. It's a 3-month program. They've got kind of an ongoing thing. And that is basically nutrition and exercise. Separately, I'd use Headspace to meditate most days. And then I also am fascinated by lots of different and interesting parts of the world and where it's going. So most mornings, whilst I'm shaving, I will listen to a lecture on YouTube or TED or something like that, focused on my areas of interest. So those are a number of the things that I do.
Yeah, fantastic. And I started using the Headspace app about a year ago, and I recommend it to all the listeners out there who are thinking about getting into meditation but not quite sure where to start. So thanks for that, Max. Where can people go to find out a little bit more about you?
About me, God knows. Go and have a look at my LinkedIn page. There's tons of stuff that I've done, so go and have a look there. And if you want to know more about Techstars, there's plenty on the techstars.com website. There's loads and loads of stuff there, and it's all really useful. And there's lots of free resources for startups as well. So if they need any thoughts or inspiration or guidance, there's lots there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I'll add all of that to the show notes for our listeners. So thanks for your time, Max. You've been an awesome guest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, man. It's
Cheers.
been great.
Well, that's it for my chat with Max Kelly. Hope you found that as insightful as I did. As always, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, I'd love it if you take just 1 minute of your time to show some love by subscribing to and giving this podcast a 5-star rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. It would mean a hell of a lot to me and the team who helped put this together, and would also help us to continue bringing you the caliber of guests that we have to date. You can join the conversation on Facebook at facebook.com/Future² podcast, or subscribe to our mailing list at Future².xyz. If you've got any questions, feel free to tweet me at Steve Glaveski, send an email to steve@collectivecamp.us, or follow me on LinkedIn. As always, we've got a ton of blogs, podcasts, videos, webinars, online classes, and innovation resources, most of which are completely free and available for you to download today at www.collectivecamp.us. So make sure you check that out when you have a moment. Until next time, keep dreaming big. Future² out.